That time comes.
We demand to see the baby. I'm sure that's an excellent strategy. Thank you, Ari. Appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you.
And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy to have you here. This is chromium, atomic number 24. You need chromium to make stainless steel. You also need chromium for chrome plating. Chromium is a useful, even a necessary thing in modern life. Mining and processing it, though, tend to be very, very toxic enterprises. Even if you like chrome, you probably would not be psyched to live near or have your kid's school near a chromium smelter or some other facility that processed this stuff. 1/3 of all the chromium in the world apparently comes from here. From this former Soviet facility in western Kazakhstan, close to the Russian border. Mark Champion at Bloomberg News just did a report on how toxic and dire the conditions are at that facility. But he also got the simple, sad story of the finances of that place and how the finances of that place that produces 1/3 of the chromium in the world ended up connected to the President of the United States. When the Soviet Union broke up and former Soviet states tried to create a new post-Soviet economic system for themselves, one of the things that happened at gigantic Soviet plants like this chromium facility is that people who worked there were literally given shares in the place they worked at. They were going to be employee owners. Mark Champion at Bloomberg this week reports on how those regular workers, those regular employees, people who are working in these very toxic conditions to supply the world with chromium, they were forced, one by one, to give up those shares, to sell those shares they've been given, but to sell them for basically nothing. And the entity on the other end of that forced transaction, the entity to which they were forced to sell their shares for less than pennies on the dollar, was like a no-name company registered in the British Virgin Islands. Right? It's incongruous when you're looking at these pictures of this bleak, landlocked Central Asian toxic site producing chromium for the world. British Virgin Islands? Really? I mean, nothing against British Virgin Islands, but international companies will often headquarter themselves there in name only as a scheme to avoid taxes and to stay anonymous. So the people who were working at this chromium plant were basically robbed of their equity. Right? They used to be employee owners. They at least used to have shares. They work in dire toxic conditions. And efforts have been made through the banking system to obscure who really owns that place, who is reaping the financial rewards from that gigantic plant, now that the people who work there aren't. Well, Bloomberg reports that the controlling interest in that plant is held by this guy, whose name is Rafiq Arif. You do not need to remember that name. But you should know that his brother created a very pronounceable company called Bayrock. There were two principals in Bayrock. One is the brother of the guy who's got the chromium plant, and the other one is Felix Sater, who at one point worked for the Trump Organization as a senior advisor to Donald Trump. Felix Sater, you might remember, is the one who was pursuing a Trump Tower Moscow project during Trump's presidential campaign. Even when Trump was saying he had no deals and no ties to Russia, during the campaign, he signed a letter of intent to pursue Trump Tower Moscow, this project that was being arranged by Felix Sater. So Sater's company, Bayrock, he was one of the principals in Bayrock. Another one of the principals was the guy who was the brother of the chromium plant, right? Bayrock was headquartered in Trump Tower. Bayrock is also the company that developed the Trump Soho hotel and condominium complex. Now, a former finance director at Bayrock brought a lawsuit last year which alleged that at least $10 million of the money behind Bayrock came straight out of that chromium plant in Kazakhstan. So around the same time that those allegedly ill-gotten gains were being smuggled out of that chromium plant in Kazakhstan, routed through a bunch of offshore companies and given to Bayrock, Bayrock at the same time was also bragging publicly about being substantially funded by another metals fortune from Kazakhstan, from that same country. Most of the metal wealth in that whole country is controlled by a trio of 3 billionaires. That's what happens when you let the entire metal wealth of a large nation be controlled by 3 guys. They all become billionaires, right? Those 3 guys formed a holding company that tried to go kind of legit a decade ago, in 2007. They tried to list themselves on a stock exchange. They tried to go public in London in 2007. Turns out to have been a terrible move. when you become a public company, that triggers all sorts of reporting requirements. You have to, be able to account for your actions as a company and for your finances. They did get themselves listed on the stock exchange in London for a time, but it created a huge scandal on the London Stock Exchange. It immediately triggered a major inquiry by the Serious Fraud Office in Britain. Within a few years, they had yanked the company off the stock exchange, and they were forced to become a private company again against their will. Here's how the Financial Times reported it when the company got yanked. Quote, "Scandal hit Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation is due to leave the stock market on Monday. The mining group, put together by 3 oligarchs from assets assembled in Kazakhstan, is being taken private by its founders after an investigation by the Serious Fraud Office." One top 20 shareholder at the company says, with the benefit of hindsight, the company's overall corporate governance, quote, "should have set off alarm bells." The investor told FT, quote, "ENRC was a company that never should have been listed in the first place and should have been left well alone." Another top 30 investor in the company says, quote, "This has not been good for shareholders, London, or anyone. It more than anything highlights the dangers of buying into companies with poor corporate governance." These guys were so corrupt they embarrassed the stock market. One of the guys who ran that apparently repulsively corrupt company, one of these 3 guys who controls all the metals in Kazakhstan, the guy who is incidentally famous for his 300-foot-long yacht. It's very nice. Bayrock also bragged in its corporate documents that he was a major investor in Bayrock, a strategic investor behind Bayrock, behind what they were able to do. And again, what that company was able to do was come up with the money for Trump Soho. So, Kazakhstan. Right? That's Kazakhstan story number 1. Next time you see something chrome-plated, take a deep breath, cough it out, and think of the Trump Soho. So that's Trump Kazakhstan story number 1. Kazakhstan story number 2 is about BTA Bank, largest bank in that big country. Kazakhstan is a big country. It's only got 18 million people, but it's the size of Western Europe. It's the largest landlocked country in the world. I think it's like the 9th largest country in the world overall. It's a quarter the size of the United States. It's gigantic. BTA Bank was the biggest bank in Kazakhstan. In 2009, the chairman of that bank disappeared. He fled the country. And what they found after he was gone, that about half of the loan book for that entire bank, half the loan book for the biggest bank in the country, appears to have been loans that the chairman made to himself. He'd invent little companies or nominally create little companies all over the place, and then he would give them incredibly generous loans. He was loaning the bank's money to himself, billions of dollars. And then he disappeared with the money. Needless to say, he was not planning on paying back any of those loans. He initially turned up in the UK, which he apparently found very much to his liking. He lived in a 15,000 square foot home. He had a 100-acre country estate. The only problem with him living in London is that British courts soon convicted him of misappropriating $4 billion from that bank. He had just fled back home in Kazakhstan. Upon being convicted, he fled the UK, went instead to France, which he also liked very much. He had a very nice villa in France, which was lovely and picturesque, until it turned out all the people working around his villa, who he thought were gardeners, were actually French police officers in disguise who